Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thanks to the Cyprus Architecture Chamber to be inviting me. I'm very proud to be here, and just spent the afternoon looking at our project here, and it's amazing and beautiful. But I have prepared a talk which is more general, and I will talk for about an hour plus maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then I hope we can engage in a conversation, Q&A. So design as second nature is referring to the contemporary architecture in particular, where we work with algorithms as quasi-laws of nature, if you like, to evolve architecture in sophisticated ways. It also hints at optimizing morphologies for performance, as all natural forms are not only beautiful but high performance. They evolved for particular performances. I've referred to this style, which is nature-like in this way, parametricism, where all the parameters are responded to and all the elements of architecture become parametrically malleable and variable, adaptive to each other and into contexts. And we perceive some of this beauty, and the question is, what is beauty? I want to start with that. What's the point of aesthetic values? So I think beauty is the promise of performance, first of all, and that's something, in some respects, a universal condition of the human condition, that we navigate the world aesthetically through being drawn to certain things and be repulsed by others, this kind of appeal and repulse condition. But we also have to sometimes learn new sensibilities, aesthetic sensibilities, as the conditions of performance shift, and as sustainability, for instance, becomes a value and an element of performance, you might shift your aesthetic sensibility from the left to the right here. So, but we also have to remember with respect to architecture, and that will have to be remembered throughout the lecture, that we're talking about not only technical performance, but about social performance. So what is the built environment? What's the beautiful built environment with respect to societal and social high performance? What does this look like, feel like, become? So we need to recognize that ideals of beauty change as the functional conditions of our life change and shift. And that goes both with human beauty, with the sense of fashion, style, as well as with respect to architecture and design. So there's a relativity historically with respect to the concept of beauty, aesthetic sensibilities, but there is always the tie-in with conditions of performance, that we recognize the high performance intuitively through being drawn to it, being conditioned to like what's good for us. But that's not, there's a certain inertia, there's potentially that we are anachronistic in our sensibilities. That's why you also need aesthetic revolutions in design and architecture to update our sensibilities and learn to like what's truly good for us in the 21st century, for instance, in terms of urban environments, etc. So our values in the 21st century for Hadid architects: versatility, variability, complexity. Social processes become more complex, the patterns of cooperation, complex and dynamic. So there's fluidity representing the dynamism of contemporary life. But also, across all of this, we need to maintain legibility, and that's a big challenge. And the primary task, I think, of design as composition, the compositional stance of making complexity and dynamism of contemporary conditions legible. And I want to start explaining this particular project because here you can see how an artistic, inverted commas, compositional approach makes an environment legible and through that socially functional. So it's a park and ride scheme in Strasbourg, and you can see the surrounding is relatively disfigured, illegible, urban clutter like you find everywhere, without identity, coherence, legibility. And then we're putting 2 car parks, a tram station and a bus station into this, and it would, under normal circumstances, just appear in the suburban disaggregation. And you can see here something, a strong compositional agenda of clarifying relationships, what ties together, how to move from one to the other, makes a significant contribution. It is perceived as beautiful because also feels good to know where you're moving, what's in front of you, and how things tie together and functioning together. And every technical element, whether it's the car park surface itself, the light posts, the demarcation lines, the road surfaces, the roof, etc., the columns, the lighting elements, they all are brought under ruthless formalism with respect to communicating relationships and what goes on in the trajectory. So the various elements function doubly as technical elements and as compositional, communicative elements. And I think that's the architectural contribution compared with engineering contribution. So social functionality through communicative capacity is architecture, and technical fulfillment of function is engineering. But we have so many technical means that we can then orchestrate those which make compositional sense. And this way it ends up that the road surface becomes very, very similar to the ceiling, for instance, in this building. Although these are technically and very, very different performances, they share a visual, language, performance, communicative performance. So I would argue that spatial communication is the architect's core competency, as we have, and at least in sophisticated societies, shed all the responsibilities for technical aspects, and also when it comes to project management or cost control, but all the technical conditions, even facade engineering, lighting engineering, all the elements, even interior surfaces, every technical things we have engineering support. So the question is, what's left for us is all about making sure that the appearance communicates the purposes and allows us to orient in ever more complex and varied environments, I would argue, as well as organizing, of course, in plan. So when we transfer this problem of legibility on the cityscape, we're having obviously a challenge because we cannot design cities like we design buildings. Exceptionally, maybe in an ideal Renaissance city plan, it was treated like this, or in an exception like Brasilia, but this is totally out of the question now. So we're facing in the city, on a district level, or on a city level, the challenge how we maintain actual eligibility in the face of this degrees of freedom and uncontrolled process of urbanization. And so individual iconic buildings can do something, and they're demarcated, but if they agglomerate randomly as they do today, you get visual chaos, and the iconography collapses under its own kind of agglomeration. And that is kind of, for instance, London. And so we have the paradox of homogenization via too much difference, like in a garbage spill. And I literally talk about garbage city and garbage spill urbanization as a challenge for the discipline. So, and then we're looking at this, and you realize that these kind of cities, which kind of urban landscape, which sprawl everywhere around the globe, you don't know where you are, where's what, and the only thing you would shape orientation, identity, navigability, legibility is actually things like the river. It has a rhythm, has a form, it has a law, a logic, a direction, or those cities. In the old days, we can't go back to it, like, as I said, Brasilia or the Baroque city. These are treated like designs. But what we can do instead is perhaps look at natural landscape which have character and identity, and not this identityless spill like we find everywhere. And it has coherencies, laws, and order, because you can guess where the water flows, where the vegetation goes, how the vegetation changes as it moves up the gradient, etc. Everything fits together and has its place, but in an open-ended process without designer. So there's a bottom-up spontaneous order, legible order, complex variegated order, and that's the model for the contemporary city for me. And here is like garbage. No species, no additional natural intervention would pop out like a piece of rubbish. So that's what we're trying to aim, and the repertoire which makes that possible means that that elements are adapted, varied, They can follow gradient transformations, and they can adapt to each other and respond to each other to form coherent ensembles and generate gradually in that build-up unique identities in the various environments. So each valley, each landscape has unique characteristics, and that's what should be the case with each city district, but also with the internal coherencies and legibility. So the buildings which participate in this would be of that range and that repertoire. They need to be varied enough, because all the variation we have now in contemporary society shouldn't be made monotonous bleached out under uniformity, but there should also be degrees of coherency, so that something large and organic unity and characterfulness and global form and order emerges out of that. And for that, the elements have to not just agglomerate like in a big garbage spill, but have to kind of tie in with each other and generate and weave a fabric which is characterful and lawful and lawfully ordered. So I don't want to go into detail with respect to the projects much more. I just want to fly you through the versatility of forms. They all have a sense of coherence because they're all like nature-like and organic-like, the endless forms of nature. But there's enormous internal variability in the oeuvre just of a single architectural firm. But then with respect to the whole paradigm of parametricism, of course, there's much more variety here. Yet at the same time, they remain identifiably 21st century. And so the features of this are this adaptive versatility, the internal transformation variation, and nothing is built up out of discrete spaces and rooms which are just added up to each other. But the space is continuously flowing and continuously transforming, and there's a lot of visual connectivity and depth across levels, from inside to outside. Everything communicates with everything else because we're in that era of synergetic cooperation in urban centers. But we also do it in the outskirts. So this idea of fitting in and adding on a building to an existing one, affiliating to the building and to the landscape at the same time. So you're multiply affiliated. Each building connects up to the various and quite disparate surroundings and transmutes and mediates between what's given. Same with this building here, for instance, the embeddedness in a context, multiple urban directions are picked up, internal coherence, and the continuous flow of spaces. And the same idea, like in the car park and ride scheme, each element, whether it's a lighting feature, a staircase, a rib, a wall, is brought under a formalism which makes them connect together and work together as a compositional system of guides which guide you through and tell you where you are in a continuously transforming space. So the essential spatial features are visually kind of underlined and marked by these elements, and they're not cluttering up the scene as alien elements which come together. The continuity between inside and outside, and a similar project here where we're trying to reveal as much as possible what's the offering and show this section, for instance, in the facade, and making clear what's going on. And what's typical is these kind of complex internal spaces where many things come together visual, so there's deep vistas, visual connections, and rules and laws, principles which orient you. For instance, everything in this building tilts. It's like, why should that be? Everything in the deep, complex building shows you where the exit is or where the plaza is. Everything tilts in the direction and is an orienting element, while it still does lots of other things. The lighting flows through, and there's a hierarchy of spaces, where natural lit spaces are primary spaces, etc. And the deep vistas and using curvature to allow you to follow trajectories, primary trajectories, is also helpful. And these kind of spaces are important where you have ongoings below, above, all around in layers, including vistas back to the outside. So you can orient where you are in a campus environment and see what's going on and participate and coordinate and cooperate. So this is characteristics of most of our buildings. Even this kind of smaller buildings, continuous interiors, connecting up rather than cutting into individual rooms rather. Baku project is one which has several institutions. It has a museum and a concert hall and conference center, as well as a library initially. So these three elements fuse very different exterior spaces, but you always know that you're part of this complex, part of this building. And it has a parkscape designed leading up to it and continues with it. You know that belongs to it. And yeah, you can always recognize it. It has varied features, which also tie together. And on the inside, there's complexity here. So you're looking cross levels. You're looking into from the inside into exterior courtyard, etc. And again, this feature that every technical or pragmatic element, whether it's a staircase and step and lighting element, all these different elements which could clutter up the space are brought under formalism to indicate and guide you through the primary spatial sequences and make the complexity you encounter legible. So the stair and the lights here trace the shape and flow of the space and become plasticity enhancing compositional elements, while at the same time fulfilling all the pragmatic function you expect from a lighting element and a staircase element. And the deep vistas where you see many things in different directions is again something which allows something this to be exhilarating, and you feel empowered because you step into something and know what's going on. You feel you know what's going on and can reach everything instead everything being kind of hidden away across levels and in different rooms. And then you still know in the same building there's a new atmosphere, a different material, the timber, a more closed space in this case, of course, for a concert hall. But the morphology keeps going, so you know it's still in the same building, and the same idea of elements being affiliated to each other to create an overall composition rather than being pragmatic elements only, they're compositional elements. And so this goes around with very, very different projects and concepts, also commercial multi-use complexes like the Beijing. And what is interesting about this is a typical urban component where hundreds of startup companies come together, a lot of cafes, bars, restaurants, shops. The ground floor is also co-living zones. So these are urban hubs, and what's empowering and beautiful here is that you have this three-dimensional urban space where all these different offerings can perceive each other and are at your fingertips, and then the formal logic of convex and concave volumes of exterior spaces and interior spaces, you can follow that and you can get a grasp of the variety of spaces which are offered. And there's a certain logic of stratifying from more public spaces to more private spaces. So this feature of atriums is something we continuously bringing in. The building which has the chance to sit into a very complex urban site, very irregular shaped site, multiple levels connecting also park with building. And that creates a very irregular, amorphous form, but it has a certain logic. You can move on top, you can move underneath, and we also using this perforated skin to somehow mute the complexity of opening. So behind this perforated skin, there's lots of windows and light coming into this building, but it doesn't clutter up, and we're only focusing on primary entrances, primary trajectories, and have to not overwhelm the visual complexity. And then you have the major cuts where you're moving into the building, and internally there's a series of quite different spaces, but they all share again a kind of fluid language and an openness and a characterfulness, which tells you you have variety and unity across variety at the same time. And these are very large public spaces with thousands of people, 30 million visitors in the first 4 years. And we're doing something here, which I think is beautiful and elegant and very refined in its execution, and I'm very, very looking forward to what we'll have here, and it's a lovely urban space across levels, integrating old and new like so many of our projects do, and experiment with new materials and materialities and ways of construction, very sophisticated. So very, very proud and happy to contribute here. This idea of continuous fields, also in this Saudi Arabian project. This one for the first time is using environmental drivers, wind and sun directions, and a field condition with a lot of variety of spaces. And a beautiful kind of covered plaza connecting up with a lot of natural light. And again, difference within that coherent ensemble of spaces, so the religious space within that as well as office spaces, workspaces, the interior spaces. And we do these kind of field conditions at the school in China with different types of classrooms, public spaces, private spaces. And we're using color, materiality, and degree of perforation and size to differentiate the zones. And in the end, there's a kind of language and semiology of articulation at play, which makes it clear how these which spaces share which function. And connecting up different conditions like a retail and lunchtime spillout condition with actually a major tower, and making these connections visible so that one space flows into the other, and you can follow the form to find your destiny, if you like. And again, multi-level connections, transparency, natural light, etc. Multi-use complex in China with an opera house, museum, multi-level plaza condition, ground condition, and quite complex spaces, foyer spaces, and a big auditorium as well. The museum, and then the idea of atria and connecting spaces is absolutely critical. Open panoramic elevators to never lose sight of where you are when you move through, and you never disappear and reappear disoriented. I think it's very important for making these complex buildings work. And in a big airport like the Beijing airport, one of the biggest airports in the world, when it's finally built, without a train, you don't disappear. It's fully pedestrian navigation of a very, very large infrastructure project, and we're using axes and heightened roof topography to pulsate you through a major orientation, central orientation space from which you kind of flow out to the gate. And that there's a logic to this, and bringing natural light again, and having free span structures, which are basically at the same time orientation devices, as so they're communicating devices as much as keeping the rain and out. So basically, you can follow these gaps that pull you out to the gates and lead you back to the main orientation space, which is multi-level. And so there are different degrees of transparency. The bright space, orientation space, and the gap, the bright light space, is the one you follow out through the gate. I just came back from the opening of this tower, which is similar principles, and we're using structure, we're making structure visible, not only to open up the space inside to make it fluid and organic, but also to give character and legibility to the space, and see the difference between the bottom, middle, and top of the tower, very strong and triangulated at the bottom, becoming more filigree at the top. It kind of opens up. So you get a sense of orientation through the transformation of the skeleton, and it's a beautiful navigation space. You come into a big atrium, you pull up with a panoramic elevator, and there's a number of public spaces, restaurant, bar, cafes, launched into this trajectory. This is when you move up in the elevator, you pass by these places. So the hollowed out tower, which you can experience like a vertical street, and you at the same time continuously maintain contact with the outside and the other towers in the cluster which belong to the same complex. you know where, which, you know, the rooms have the structure imprinted and give character to the hotel room, to the breakfast bar. We also did some of the interiors, like the restaurant, bridge, and special room with pool. And again, the soft corner, the structure, you know where you are after a gambling night. And at the top, it opens up to a pool area with special suites at the top as well. So I believe architecture must speak, and we use structure, environmental transformation, and algorithmic, organic logics which vary and adapt buildings to make them legible, what they connect to. And so when I'm talking about the eloquent city, we need to overcome this, which I call the mute city, the monotonous and mute city, where whatever goes on there, you don't know the differences. And it was a simpler society, of course, where there was only a very simple life pattern of 9 to 5 working on the assembly line or in an office, and the different products which were created were only a handful, like a washing machine, a TV, a car, a package of cornflakes for everybody. It was great in terms of progress, material progress, but we're in a different stage and state, so we can no longer use this kind of architecture to generate our cities, because they're also segregating us and making these kind of mute, monotonous structures. They would bleach out and hide the richness and complexity and variety of life offerings and urban offerings we now expect and want to find. And so we now have actually moved on to a very complex, chaotic city. It's called the noisy city. That's still not the eloquent city, but it's better to have that noisy. It tells me something, even though it's very hard to find your way and know which city you're in. So the question is, what is the eloquent city? And I think it must be a complex, very good order like nature, but go back to the mute city, the modernist city. And these were serious, prescient proposals which became true 50 years later. 50 years later, although 30, 40 years later already, they become kind of dystopian nightmares. The Super Studio said, yes, you know, we run already, it had run its course and became an oppressive nightmare. So these are kind of ironic statements at the time, and in the 70s and then in the late 70s, early 80s, that break away from the monotony and the craving for difference and of articulation, so the postmodern recycling of historical motifs and this attempt to make all these buildings different. But this kind of pure variety of difference quite quickly also get lost, because you can't remember 50 differences. You need to give hierarchy and variation and connection as much as difference. This is also the So the postmodernist city is a city of collage, in the end leads to the noisy city. And this was the Venice Biennale of 1980. This craving for variety and making architecture speak, but it becomes a cacophony, it becomes a kind of self-collapsing over-diversity, because there's no relatedness, no hierarchy, no coherence, no order in these collages. And okay, now, but we need the city. It's not just we don't like the look of it. The city morphology and its kind of bringing us together structure is a human universal which we need to have, and it's empowering the societal processes and social order, and requires the spatial order. And if it's very disordered, it is stressful and dysfunctional. So the built environment has always played this role as an ordering matrix, and so that we can find each other and cooperate in the division of labor, which makes the prosperity and freedom we all experience possible through the cooperative societal process, you know, which makes us free and powerful to the extent that we now can fly around the world and watch movies on the way and sip a nice lunch and come out and participate in communication process which is now global. So the city, we need to look at that sorting machine which generates and sustains the social process, but it's a sorting machine which we need to actively navigate, and it only functions as long as it is legible and understood and transparent so that we can function properly. Of course, if you, in a traditional society where you always do the same thing every day, it's trivial. You know where you are. In a small town, you quite quickly know where you are, but we're not living in that. If you're going to the big cities where you haven't seen every district and you move from city to city, you need to be able to quickly orient and navigate and get together. And also in these big buildings, you need to see what's going on. So we need to have that order. And to go back a bit into the deep history, that has always been the case to some extent, and now it's the case on a new level of complexity. But that the society and the various actors and social status groups and types of activities are sorted, ordered, brought together and connected up through the built environment is critical to grasp. That's been always the condition, and only through the built environment and settlements like this can society emerge, and you can have larger and larger groups structured and accruing and growing up the city in concentric circles often, and maintain a kind of social order beyond kind of a flock of 20 or so primates which are roaming around naked in the wilderness. They cannot make society, but we can, because we have a built environment which we can build up, and you can build up quite complex, lively scenes. And of course, this can only go on because there's a place for everything, and where various actors have their sites and places, the various institutions find each other, and you can see that there's a lot of design in there, and every social institution needs to work with the spatial frame to understand the various social roles and patterns and protocols of interaction are inscribed in these built environments. And that's something which now still happens and should perhaps happen on a new level of dynamism and complexity. And we need to start modeling the interaction process. And that is something which I'm working on in my research department. So going back to history, so you have these social kind of diagrams and social order structures nested hierarchically and building up larger and more encompassing global structures. And this is the Forbidden City. You know, if you want to run an empire, you need to have a kind of strong, large spatial machine to have that administrative order machine doing that complex administrative task. And again, what is interesting from the design perspective, so I'm talking here as an urban designer, architectural designer, interior designer, but also product and fashion designer. We need also that graphic overlay on us, as well as we'll talk later, or the graphic overlay on the built environment, to create that semiological system to differentiate the various roles. And traditionally that was much more ritualized, with less degrees of freedom. Today we do it, we're self-sorting into a fluid matrix of role differentiation, and we identify ourselves. And I think that's a very important aspect, the human universal. You don't find any human society which doesn't do that, so it's an absolute necessity. And this graphic differentiation is also necessary in the built environment, like a encoding graphic overlay, let's say. And you find that also universally under the heading of decoration to demarcate. So if you move from animal to human, we actually, this idea of not only a built settlement with variously demarcated and decorated markings, but also the self-transformation is an absolute universal. And I'm hinting at this because that's what I think architecture and design has a lot to do with it. It has to build a language of communicating social differences and activity differences, etc. So I think that's very, very important, and it becomes part of my project, Architecture as Communication. But it is all the design disciplines which connect up in this story of the semiological project. So when I'm talking about ordering processes, we need to understand that architecture delivers this not necessarily always through physical walls, fences, gates, physically separating and privileging and controlling access, but more and more in a free self-sorting according to semiological clues. So you have these kind of demarcation which order the various activities. And so it's not shelter but order which you should look at as architects as the primordial function of the built environment. And because we're into social functionality, not technical functionality, so the way a space structures an interaction diagram is more important than the fact, or that's our responsibility, and that everybody can understand the situation and can self-sort into the configuration. That's architecture's task, and that the roof or the walls don't collapse on us or keep the kind of heat or cold out, that's engineering business. So we need to realize that. And when we're looking at scenes like this, not because we have football you're missing right now, but because this is a metaphor and analogy for this ordering function of space and design, where you have the different zones with different protocols of interaction, different types of players, which you can see here with the referee and the different teams demarcated, and then interacting according to these rules which are inscribed in the spatial situation. And we understand the language of space. Which zone has which protocols of interaction for which player, whether the keeper has this space, who has a certain privilege, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's an analogy for the way the built environment functions. And we are starting to play and simulate the social functionality which we want to engender and structure with our spaces, and make that the driver for the design process, to verify the social functionality of our design process. And this again is different actors, players, there's maybe staff, visitors, managerial staff, hierarchy, different zones and sub-zones with different protocols of interaction. So we want to see, do we generate a productive, cooperative interaction process, for instance, in a corporate environment? And how would we do that? How would we optimize that and verify this? So I've said these things, so I don't have to reread them. So in the end, the built environment must become information rich, so that it gives a lot of empowering information for the users and actors to find the various activities, to understand the nuances of the various protocols, so that a more sophisticated and differentiated and productive interaction can take place. So if you have a very, very dense urban environment with a lot of traffic of various kinds, lorries, buses, bicycles, motorbikes, pedestrians, you need a semiological system. You need the space to be structured with various curbs and lanes and types of demarcations, crossings, dashed, continuous lines, parking lanes, etc. So that's just another metaphor, an analogy, how the built environment functions, and I want to kind of transmute that. And this particular language, the spatio-visual language of the kind of semiological code of the traffic rules, and I expand from there and say, what are the semiological and articulated rules of societal interaction across all its range of interaction modes and moods, and what would be the language which empowers that in the built environment in general. So when these are research projects where we try to think about this, let's say in terms of in corporate territory, a university campus or Google corporate campus, etc. And again, to start making differentiations and therefore having a more self-assured social process. This is self-ordering. There's degrees of freedom. There's not scheduled, but you have something to go by for the self-organization process. rather than having a gray, undifferentiated surface or monotonous, unarticulated surface, where it is less easy to quickly lock into meaningful patterns. So sometimes the whole city needs to look at this. If it was just a gray, undifferentiated rubber surface, and don't worry for a moment about bad weather or wind or so on. And imagine in LA or somewhere, the whole of the city of 1 million people being just an undifferentiated rubber surface, and then you strip everybody naked, so you have 1 million naked body roaming on an undifferentiated rubber surface. You instantly know that society cannot continue, because you don't know who is who, what's where, what's going on, So would then call for this kind of graphic playing field. You would have to inscribe the football field, as it were, onto that. And we're not talking architecture, we're talking about pure ordering through semiology, so spatial relations and articulations, through kind of color-coded, material-coded. And that's the way I want to look at architecture. Wow. But we have to look at this at each stage of civilization anew, where the rules, the complexity changes, the players change, there's less ritualite, more degrees of freedom. So we need to look at this historically. And we can't just kind of find the solution in a historical city. Historical cities were much more rigorously encoded semiologically. And as you also remember, the dress code at this time was very strict. You couldn't self-express. You were dressing up according to your age, position, whether you're married or unmarried, etc. And that made sense, so that you have order and rules. And so now we're in a different position. And just walk you through the way the societal evolution happens. And that you, by the way, that we have a kind of concentric circles. That's just the quickest and cheapest way to enclose something. And then you then go from there to kind of a radial expansion. That's a natural necessity. So these are very, very kind of unplanned, natural, evolved conditions. But you can then sort into this the various crafts, the various special places, the marketplace, the councillors' meeting, the place of worship. And these are kind of the organs of the social body. At a certain stage, then proliferating around Europe, then you have the big bang of the Renaissance, where in a way the ideal Renaissance city like you have here is just in kind of a rationalized drawing up of the medieval undesigned city, rationalized. But once you have that, you can rapidly expand and experiment, and it shifts into new ideas very quickly. And you can see here, kind of draw the different elements of that civic institution, and you can build it out and roll it out quickly. And then we're moving on to the next stage, from the mercantilist, from the early capitalist city-states into Baroque, let's say France, or the papal Rome, and you have a very different conception, a much more expansive conception, and you have to suddenly construct a much larger administrative order, which you cannot deliver with the Renaissance of adding up a few crystalline buildings. The Baroque is something very different. Only the Baroque can deliver that very, very large, complex, integrated scene and institution, and make that clear through curvature, through local asymmetry and global symmetry, to build up something much, much larger, which is outside the capacity of the Renaissance. So what I'm hinting at is that the stylistic transformations from Renaissance to Baroque, and we're going neoclassicism, historicism, modernism, postmodernism, they make sense historically with respect to particular societal constellations. And the features of the Baroque, also with the colossal order, deep relief, are all geared up to make a very large, complex whole legible. And this is the Baroque city. Now this breaks down if you have laissez-faire capitalism, move from mercantilism, absolutism to laissez-faire capitalism. We have the kind of raw agglomeration of the industrial city with market freedom, no longer controlled through royal prerogative, and suddenly you get these kind of scenes, and the city is very different, and it becomes kind of historicism or you get the aesthetic of the picturesque. You couldn't maintain the Baroque order, and you had to allow degrees of freedom of a sprawling capitalism, and then you aestheticize this with this aesthetic of the picturesque, where you allow a kind of ponderated conglomerate and find that beautiful. And we have to always go through these aesthetic revolutions which aestheticize the next stage, the new stage of the morphology of a civilization. And then the next stage is let's say, state capitalism, no longer laissez-faire, the social democratic capitalism of modernism. And New Age comes out, Fordism, mechanical mass reproduction, the masses as clients. And you can see here the way the modernist architecture picks up from industrial architecture, allows for asymmetry, allows for endless proportions, throws away symmetry and proportion for this kind of mechanical mass reproduction aesthetics. So the aesthetics of modernism has to do with the technological age, with the social age of mass democracy, of mass reproduction. So again, these things make sense with respect to the historic socio-economic era. And Brasilia is an element. And at this stage, you can actually centrally plan a kind of city at that point. I mean, you had new towns, new cities, industrial cities. They were plannable to some extent because there was only a few things you would need to do: electrify, factory zone, residential zone, everybody a washing machine, a car, a packet of cornflakes, etc. And you get this kind of era which marks the 20th century. And it's quite interesting the way Le Corbusier's vision of 1924 of the radiant city with this kind of business district, residential district, manufacturing district, logistics and retail district, how this became kind of reality in a way, globally. So the understanding the era, understanding the industrial age of mass production and mass democracy made it possible for somebody like Le Corbusier and Hilbersheimer to develop models which were winning models. Now, this was, and I'm inspired by this prescience and the way the Bauhaus worked out in a very small group the whole design philosophy of the 20th century and then see it unfold across the decades. And the three characters who were involved, Corbusier, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, they met together at Behrenshoff in 1915, developing this, and then in 1965, they're still alive, seeing this come to fruition 50 years later. It's great inspiration, but of course, this couldn't have continued. And then there had to be a revolution and a rejection of that model, which was good up to this point, but a mistake to continue further, because we don't want and we don't have to rest with 9 to 5 for our whole life and only eating cornflakes, maybe every 10 years another variety of flavor, one TV channel, one packaged holiday. I mean, that's not the life we want and wish for. Nowadays at the age of 20, you've been already roaming the globe and you're staying in a much more richer life, a much more potent and productive life. Instead of one TV channel, we have thousands to choose from. And that's made possible by another technological revolution. I mean, modernism, we had this kind of world where you were in the factory town because everybody was locked into the assembly line and everybody could have that car. It's amazing that the Model Ford T in the 20s, you reached a point where it was only like a half a year's salary could deliver to the worker of the Ford factory himself a car. So incredibly potent. At the same time, now we're in a different world. We have lots of tailored operations and all the people are gone. They're also gone out of agriculture. So we don't need people in manufacturing and agriculture. They're all coming to the city. That's why there's not this suburban rollout, but we have this concentration back into the big cities. And what we're doing, we actually continuously creative industry, research, development, marketing, financing to reprogram these robots and creating new products all the time. That's the kind of new society. And we are in this kind of dynamic ecosystem of the creative industry, R&D, marketing, finance hub, the urban superbrain are no longer in these kind of bureaucratic hierarchies, factories, in the green field, but we need to coming into the big prosperity engine like London and have that very, very open dynamic system of finding each other. And that's why we need the degrees of freedom. Planning this is impossible, and nobody has planned that. The planners holding on to some kind of rearguard action, but I think they're only hampering the free self-organization of finding the synergies of what ties in with what collaborates well with what. You need freedom to discover this, and that's what the city will look like. And that's why you have urbanism disappearing in that era of post-Fordism. That's why we also had the neoliberal revolution, kind of reintroduction of something which is more similar to free market capitalism and the free market urbanization process. Makes a lot of sense, delivers that new productivity boost, but it is a huge challenge for urban planning. And in a sense, planning disappears. So we at that bottom part here, the collage city, the global phosphorus network society, is very different from the modernist city. And I think shouldn't be that collage city, it should be the parametricism city. But what I'm going to relate to in terms of the technology is the driver in the end, and the new technologies are, of course, computation and telecommunication, which have unleashed that new dynamic, and it shows up in that urban renaissance. We don't have to be in the agricultural fields, in the suburban factories. We can come together. We have this huge urban renaissance around the world, and we want to densify and have mixed use, and we want to network and be 24/7 connected up to find each other, to hatch out new projects, new creative ideas, because there's all these robots wait to be reprogrammed to do new things every day. So that's the components of that urban superbrain, as I call it, should look like this, where you have kind of continuous networking, where everybody sees what everybody else is doing and connects up and follows up. If you hide in your room or in a province for a year, whatever you've been working on is irrelevant because somebody else already done it a long time ago, or nobody needs what you're doing anymore. So you need to continuously calibrate. Everybody needs to recalibrate what they're doing with what everybody else is doing in that continuous network. So that's what I call this kind of super brain of the knowledge society. That's the city, a city like London or New York and many others. But lots of smaller cities become like that. Startup hubs are kind of a thing of the time. And the social relations change. So you're no longer locale bound. You're no longer locked into a career for 50 years, which is exactly the same. And you're much more fluid and open in these collaborative networks rather than in a corporate hierarchy. And the buildings should look different. I mean, the corporate buildings were these 3 or 4 departments. In each of them, repetition, connections between them minimal. These are the diagrams of the modernism. And now we're kind of interpenetrating domains, complex, swarm-like formation, very dynamic, very open. And it's interesting for me that these kind of swarm formations, which are very parametricism-like, are the early examples of Bürolandschafts, high-performance, creative industry corporates started to look like this in the interior. They didn't want these separations. They wanted big open fields and a kind of continuous animated network. And we said, radicalize that, field conditions, open, fluid, continuously varying and transforming conditions across the section as well, 3-dimensionally. And instead of these kind of grids of tables, you have something much more dynamic. Now we have deteriorized working conditions. Oftentimes we're creating a building for 500 workers, but there's no allocated seats. They're just scapes to roam around in. We've done such projects. Or we're doing a big technology center in Moscow, where we have this 3-dimensional urban landscape where you can roam around and team up and find each other and reconnect continuously. And then maybe the elements themselves become kinetic and intelligent and help and find each other to set up scenes and conditions. So I think this is a new world we need to grasp. And I'm talking about corporate domain and the production process, which is now knowledge and design and creation process, that's where civilization is moving forward. It's not what we would like to do in our spare time. That's relatively marginal. Okay. It is whatever brings that next prosperity level, which becomes compelling, and which life patterns that demands of us is what matters. We can continue. But it's not connected to Can we just click through these? So these are yeah, go on. So even when it comes to towers, we want to open them up on the inside. I want to make the towers hollow so that you can see what's going on. Something we do in Beijing. So all the different players can see who's working, what's going on, where's the conference, where's the activity, and keep connected to the outside, to the next tower. Something we're doing in Beijing at the moment. And this is the sketch we did for headquarters for Hyundai. So it's radicalizing this into the mega atrium where you literally see thousands of people around you. These are huge companies. Why would they bring everybody into a big building? So that they have synergy, so that they can cooperate, that they be in touch with each other. But now if you slice that all up into floors, and on each floor a core which disconnects even everything which on a single floor, you'll have thousands of people which are blind to each other. And I said these people need to be in each other's faces. The spaces and events should communicate with each other. They're part of a big global network, and that's what these buildings should look like. And then also from building to building, a bit like in Hong Kong, where you have bridges from one building to another, with continuous, dense, three-dimensional urban matrix would be ideal, but then you also need to have differentiation, so that maybe is still too monotonous. That will be my self-critique of this. But so we're actually doing buildings like this for a conglomerate in China, where you have this kind of fantastic interior urbanism to allow this. And ideally, it's not only one building, but multiple buildings which connect up. So just to walk you through this kind of history, we need to think it through historically from the medieval to Renaissance to the Baroque, modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism. So postmodernism and deconstructivism try to cope with that new flexibility, openness, complexity of the post-modernist network society. And I think they were transitional. And I think we need to move from there to parametricism, because the problem with these models is that they create this garbage spill, illegible visual chaos. And they can't allow you to orient in that complex variegated order. So that's what, and this is far too monotonous. So, but I want to show you where we're going with these kind of models. So there is connecting up, there's lawful variation, there's a lot of variety, but it's not a randomly distributed variety. So there's something gradually transforming so that there's an ordered variety. But again, this remains too monotonous. There needs to be multiple sub-districts. So we're delivering, we're working towards something. Models of urban districts, master planning, where there is variety, where there's embeddedness, where there is connecting up, and where you have a robustness later on of differentiating. So instead what we're having now is we're having this kind of, what is great here is the density, the variety. What is problematic is the randomness. So you don't know what you're encountering in the next step, what is behind, where you are. You totally get kind of lost in this garbage spill. And these cities could be anywhere. And nobody likes that. This kind of identityless condition where you don't know which city you are, which district you are. And this kind of spill goes on forever. And we have this disorder. And what we need is actually a kind of bottom-up order. And again, yes, sometimes an icon kind of sticks out. but how much can that do? You know, and it kind of gets swamped quite quickly. And so this is my favorite image of this, because it really looks like a garbage spill. And you don't know where this is, when I can tell you. This is actually Tokyo, which was kind of at one time rightly celebrated. The kind of chaos of Tokyo in the 80s was celebrated as being something liberating and thrilling. There was a vitality. This was also when Japan was the most dynamic, most prosperous, and the fastest growing society. So we need to learn to love that relative to the monotony of Brasilia. But at the same time, it's clear that this is menacing and disorienting at the same time. So, but you can see that the Liebeskind or the deconstructivist drawing were aestheticizing the reality of the collage city. So again, aesthetic revolution was necessary, because we need to say you should adore and love that complexity and chaos, rather than wanting to be in a kind of neat historical center. But at the same time, as I say now, these are problematic. Because imagining the whole globe being kind of filled with that garbage spill, to some extent that was happening. So what I'm saying, we need to reject both the monotony and that chaos. Of course, I prefer chaos over monotony. And so this becomes the model for me. Not a kind of attempt for a single hand, a master planner, a master engineer, to write all these algorithms and design that complex city. It must be a multi-author, bottom-up, self-organizing structure where the different individual contributions are not following a global plan, but they're following individual rationality of connecting up, of fitting in, because the whole point while a developer moves, if he's free to move in a particular district, to connect up there, to find synergetic collaborators there, and then the architect should articulate this. So this becomes my model of the eloquent city. Now, how would that translate? How would that be working? The first thing is that we need degrees of freedom for developers to freely find each other with their clients, the places and spaces. They need to be free to determine density, to determine program, to be with their hotel and club or shop or various mixed-use complexes exactly where they would like to be, or if they have a site, they need to do what the site requires, not what is in some kind of land use plan, which was signed off 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Even if it was updated 5 years ago, that cannot happen. So we need to have the kind of creative discovery process of the market, trial and error, profit loss, to develop that programmatic order. But then we need to, and I've written about it, you can look that up. We need to have the architects come in and give shape, legibility, and articulation, and each site independently resonating with what's around, making the connections, stitching and weaving the continuities in a bottom-up process without master designer. So when you look at the river, as I said earlier, this is what gives shape. And we're just looking at systems and models and analogies where you could have, at the same time, unpredictable and open-ended differentiation, adaptation to contingencies, yet coherency and lawfulness. So this is both coherent, lawful, and variegated, and you can throw anything into it, and the river will adapt to it, but it will not be a garbage, it will find its logical adaptation to this. And in the end, you can trace back. You know where the big islands are, where the small islands are, where the route is, so you can read these patterns. They're not chaotic. They are complex, but they are legible. So this is with swarm formation, this is with these kind of natural formations. They're complex, they're variegated, but they're ordered and logical, so you can find your way in them. But they're also very robust and ready to adapt to changing contingencies that come out. So we're looking at a lot of these kind of models, And then we're trying to construct city models in analogy to this. How would one do this? But it could also be multiple designers, of course, equipped with algorithmic intelligence, with the sensibility and ethos of adaptation, of connection, of resonance. And the natural orders, I mean, there's a lot of, it's never random, it's never, and it remains therefore always legible, but it is highly varied and differentiated. So this is kind of research work we're doing with students in various universities at the CAA in Vienna and at Harvard, etc. And we're trying our own way. And you adapt to the contingencies also of historic fabric. You tie in with this, and you have variety. You have certain mechanisms to stitch a path network. I think that's a series of topologies and distributions and typological transformations from courtyards to atriums, etc., etc. And this is just one architect. We can take a large district, but we could also be several architects layering on top of each other if they're part of a new paradigm. So we all, as a discipline, converge onto this kind of methodology, versatility, and way of working, and this has more variety and creative potentials than all the previous styles put together. We can, I think, make this collectively happen. We can create something like this. And some of these projects, this one here at the left-hand side, is actually a multi-author project. We tried that as students, so there's 10 different students doing different projects, connecting up with each other. If you look closely, they have each of their own idea there, but they also have a not continuity to generate a district identity across multiple individual conditions. And again, there's endless inspirations through nature, and this is some of our architectures. And you can see that it's never random, it's stratified, it's structured, but it's also adaptive. And so these would be the models. And we're trying to do this where you have a lot of layeredness, a lot of mixed use, a lot of different textures and variation, but it's never random, it's never arbitrary, it's always rule-based, algorithms-based. And okay, this would be just one system. And then there could be a second and third and fourth and fifth coming in to build something which has, of course, this has a lot of variety, but it's still far too monotonous for what we really need. So these are scripts which delivering the whole kind of variety of different building types onto topography according to rules. It's all kind of rule-based population. So it's what I'm talking about, the metaphor of a multi-species ecology. And there's no God, there's nobody who's designed the overall, but the ecology emerges with each species has a rationality, has an interest to connect up with the resources it finds and then adapt its form to these conditions. And if each developer or each client, each institution has the freedom to find and then empowered with an architect, weave itself into this texture, you will look back at it and it will not be that identityless random spill anymore. And you can see in these natural environments that much more simpler organisms like animals can actually quickly navigate and find their prey because these things aren't random. And you know, human settlements used to be kind of quasi-species, quite naturally, with rules, which had, through the constraints of material topography, were fitting in quite naturally, like another plant species or animal species. Rule-based. These rules weren't written down, but they were the constraints which were imposing themselves. So, for instance, you have a lot to learn actually from the vernaculars adaptation to topography, the climatic adaptation, passive systems. You get a lot of morphological, because this is an evolutionary process which delivered these, similar to where all organisms have been delivered. And we now can make algorithmic evolutionary process to find these kind of solutions. And also if you go to kind of favela conditions, there's a kind of natural order forming, and these are kind of models we can look at. So this is the overview where we've kind of moved historically, and that's where we're kind of starting to go. I'm rejecting these models now because they're too much single-hand models, and too large single-hand kind of conditions, and there needs to be much more variety and dynamism in these. We've done some of these. And we still do them. I mean, we won't resist them, but we know that the larger these master plans are, the less realistic they are that they could stay like this. But if we had colleagues and a discipline where all architects would be equipped to continue a process in their own way, these models would be more robust than at the moment when these buildings are handed out to the usual kind of suspects of architecture. Everything will fall apart quite quickly. But we've asked to do these quite large master plans in Asia right now. And what I find sometimes, if you allow the free market would actually build these kind of skylines, if these are precisely the extrusions of the land value distributions. You find, I mean, kind of these three-dimensionally extruded land value maps, you get these kind of quite strong, legible rhythms where you can see where where the train stations are as peaks, so you see where river edges are with height distribution. So you get more legibility if you let the market actually tease out the conditions through an optimization process. And then you come in as an architect and you articulate that strongly. And we did kind of projects like this. I wanted to show this, like Google Campus at Harvard with my students. There's a lot of, let's say, variety, different shells and colors. But this is one author. The second author did another version. The third author did another version. But on a scale even like a Google Campus, each of them becomes problematic as being maybe already too monotonous. So it should be all three systems with their variations should be at play in something as large as a Google Campus for 50,000 people. So we can no longer work with this kind of authorial hand and the single system condition. So and each of these four types of articulation should be at play in such a shell condition, not only one or two, to have variety and similitude at the same time. So you have always similitude across, up and down and laterally, both similitude and difference at the same time. You need that to create a kind of rich, ordered condition. And we do that also with towers and clusters of towers. These are student attempts, projects to attempt to get away from the collage into something more integral. And with these projects, I said, each of these are different authors tying together in something and observing each other or in sequence adapting on top of each other. And the final stage is, so how are we doing this? How are we getting more empowered to do this? Where's our enriched vocabulary? So the latest stage of parametrism, where we don't only work with NURB surfaces and let's say fluid curves, etc., we have much more variety. You can see the richness of materiality, of morphology, which comes out of structural logics and fabrication logics, which are unique, whether it's a curved folding and sheet logic, whether it's a carbon fiber weaving logic, whether it's a kind of hot wire cutting, ruled surface logics, these conic logics. So you get a huge variety of families. Each of them has a lot of adaptive variation. They also can have similitudes between them, and becomes a world nearly like the endless form of nature under tectonism, these are driven by engineering and fabrication logics, which have always been the repertoire which makes form and ornament. So there is an inherent technical rationality, but we as architects care about the expressive variety which delivers. And we want to orchestrate them in the palette of articulating the social conditions and subconditions and hierarchies, what belongs together, what's different, what connects up. That's what our task is, and the engineers bring in the technical rationality. So that's what I call tectonism, the stylistic heightening of engineering, fabrication-based form finding and optimization processes for the project of semiological and phenomenological articulation, for the communicative project. For me, these are communication projects. So it has been always like this, that something which was technical becomes expressive and semiological, where the various degrees of rustication show you where's the workshops, where's the piano nobile, where's the private quarters. This kind of ornament, the kind of heightening of technical repertoires into ornament and that into a semiological language has always been the case. But it wasn't articulate, it wasn't talked about. And we now can do that much more explicitly and more refined. So the parametrism as a kind of technically congenial and very advanced, computational and technically advanced methodology is necessarily then also the register for the compositional and articulation project, which is ultimately the architectural project. And of course there are examples through works like Frei Otto, where you have a kind of proto-parametricism, where you have proto-tectonism, or works engineers like Philip Bloch we're working with fantastically thin and varied marble structures. And the beauty of this is that you can create optimized marble structures with every contingent, varied, complex plan diagram, and you can optimize out, and then we can start to read the plan off the form, because there's rule and logic, so you can infer back. And that's the beauty of this kind of style. It is inherently information rich. So we're working with these repertoires, and you can see here shell structures, super high performance concrete shells with different reticulation and ribbing, and they become also a varied range of ornamentation, inverted commas, where you can characterize the degree of festiveness, the different types of spaces articulate, because again, if you have 50, 60 shells, that becomes disorienting if they're not becoming a lawfully differentiated, navigable kind of condition. So we can do that. And again, we have research where we look for material systems, nearly like the endless form of nature, to expand the repertoire of architecture. So you have technical logics, tensile structures of various kinds. And tensile structures always have a very particular and recognizable physiognomy. You can always recognize it. Whatever varied it is, you know this is another tensile. So you can use it to connect up all the types of spaces. You use tensile, whatever shape, form, they're always recognizable through their form. And we can use these families and make the complexity of our built environment navigable and legible. And that's the key. And with the complexity of the built environment, if you look at that visual chaos of London, you need all of that. You actually needed all of that already, perhaps for a big kind of Google campus for 50,000 people, to bring that home. And again, this is technical, appropriating from the engineering innovation, the repertoires of articulation. And the beauty of something like this, super light, that's one thing, but also it has a kind of characterfulness and organic logic. You can follow the forces. So we're having this world of robotic fabrication technical optimization to become the compositional repertoires to do what we started to do when I started the lecture about the park and ride scheme, to have a palette of artistic articulation which becomes the spatial visual language of a new complex environment. So this is the new kind of palette with which we want to deliver the eloquent city. And again, when we're doing a skeleton now in design, we need to use optimization processes, but you can also immediately see the beauty and characterfulness and the way when you shift supports or loads around and the patterning of these structures. There's an enormous amount of legibility in these. And then again, environmental parameters as drivers as well. So the building looks different from different sites because it's shading and opening. And again, this project where you have the same drivers of wind and air impacting on the solid volumes and on the canopy so that they both participate in this. They also then participate visually, creating a coherent territory. So this is the latest stage of parametricism, tectonism, which I want to introduce at this stage and then invite you to buy into this, learn this, pick this up and participate in the creation of an eloquent city, because if we all having our own stylistic predilections and tastes and little hobby horse projects, we could never generate a city which is worthwhile and characterful. We can only generate, no matter how beautiful and smart the little building is, we can only generate an overall garbage heap. So that was my message. Thank you.